Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 2016 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today Don will discuss transition and evolution of vertebrates, that between land-dwelling and flying reptiles. In his talk, he will present an overview of pterosaurs, flying reptiles that lived during the age of dinosaurs. So without further delay, I present you Dr. Don Henderson.
Although my official title is Curator of Dinosaurs, for good and bad, I'm interested in an awful lot of different things. And one of them is pterosaurs. I feel they just don't get enough attention. They're quite amazing, but they are so rare and so fragile that our views of them for the longest time have been rather poor. But in the last 20 years, things have really come along. Amazing new fossils and new ways to study them, so that's what I want to highlight. I want to say something about this picture. Here's good old overhyped celebrity Tyrannosaurus, and in the back is the token pterosaur. Pictures of the Mesozoic, they usually have some vague sort of pterosaur things in the background. These ones look an awful lot like Pteranodon, quite a well-known one from North America. But, reflecting the general ignorance, these two never saw each other. They missed each other by 14 million years. So I thought this is a nice picture, but it also highlights that the masses have an awful lot to learn, so do paleo illustrators, about pterosaurs. So I want to cover how we discovered them, their relationships, highlight features of their anatomy, and their relationship to other archosaurs, other extinct reptiles, and then highlight some really exceptional fossil sites. And the last thing I want to show you is a somewhat controversial idea that I presented about 5 years ago. Some people liked it, some people hated it. It was great fun, and I'll show you what it is later. So, in the paleo biz, you hear a bit more about pterosaurs than most outsiders would. And in August, I was at the 5th meeting of the Flugsaurier conference series. It's about every 3 years, and it started in 2001, and I was at the first one. And it roams around the world and being hosted in different places. And there was about 50, 60 people there. Maybe about half of them specialized just on pterosaurs. So there is still there's an active research group now, and I think that reflects this last 20 years, the improvement in our knowledge of them. So pterosaurs are characterized by flight, and it's powered flight. And by powered flight, I mean active flapping of the forelimbs. So things like flying frogs and flying snakes and flying squirrels are not actually flying, they're gliding. To be called a powered flight, you have to be actively using your forelimbs up and down to produce not just the lift to keep you in the air, but to propel you forward. And the most recent evolutionary innovation of that was bats about 50 million years ago. Birds did it sooner at 150 million years. But pterosaurs had it mastered at least 230 million years ago. So, and this, reflecting the Tyrrell Museum's backboned animal bias, we're just talking about backboned animals here, but there's insects as well, that would vastly outnumber any other flying vertebrates. But we'll stick with the pterosaurs today. This is the very first pterosaur fossil recognized for what it was, a flying extinct animal. It was from 1784. The quarries where these things are found were being mined by the Romans for floor tiles, these flat stones. And they must have seen the fossils, but they didn't care or they didn't recognize them. But finally, in the late 18th century, people recognized this as something special. And it's such a good fossil, you couldn't want a better pterosaur fossil, except if it had soft tissue and pigment and lying on a nest. But anyway, this'll do. So there's a bit of a jumble, but everything's there, which is really amazing. So there's the skull and jaws. And a really exceptional thing, the eye socket, the eye is absolutely huge. And look how far back it is on the skull. There's not much space for gray matter at the back there. But they did manage for a long time. Everything about them is extremely slender and built for lightness. If you look at the bones, you can see they're all crushed in a bit. Pterosaurs took the idea of the bicycle frame construction to extreme. So you think a bicycle frame, it's hollow tubes all put together. It's very strong and very light, but it can't be compressed longitudinally, it'll buckle. But it's quite good to resist torsion and bending. And So there's a neck, and this kind of neck is same length as the trunk region. And this kind also has a very tiny tail at the top there. There's a whole left leg, and because this thing's a bit of a mess, there's the right foot down there. But what's really distinctive about the pterosaurs is their forelimbs. So here's the right forearm, there's the hand, and here's this exceptional wing finger. It's the fourth finger. It's got the same standard number of bones, but they've all been greatly elongated. And right away, even in the beginning of the 19th century, people were thinking this must be supporting some sort of membrane to help them fly. It was Georges Cuvier in 1801 that first, in the published description, recognized that this is a flying reptile. Everybody else had different ideas, but he was able to show that this is a reptile, and it would have been flying. And it's significant that the first Flugsaurier meeting was in 2001. That was the 200th anniversary of the official description of a pterosaur. And you'll notice the name on the top there on that slide is pterodactyl. A lot of common name for them, people will refer to these things as pterodactyl, but the preferred name now is to call them pterosaur. So, as I mentioned, pterosaurs were recognized early on as being reptiles, but a lot of people still insisted that a flying reptile, that's just a contradiction. So there's this nice illustration from 1800. I took this from a publication from Kevin Padian, and it's really nice. He has this image. Someone drew the restoration on the back of a letter. You can see the handwriting through the paper. So again, they're trying to think of them as mammals. This von Sömering in 1817 was still arguing these things are some sort of mammal, and he was restoring them like that, like looking like a bat. And then there was this Edward Newman, I'm sure he's no relation to our Newman, restoring it as some sort of marsupial. This top one, this thing creeps me out. This looks weird. But even as late as 1843, people are still trying to argue that they were mammals. So there was a good stream of fossils from that site in Germany, which I'll show you later. But then in 1828, there was outside of Germany, sort of expanding their range, came this animal Dimorphodon from the south coast of England, early Middle Jurassic. And this is Mary Anning. She was the famous person who was found the first as a schoolgirl. I guess she didn't go to school that much. She was probably about 12. Her and her brother found the first ichthyosaurs, the first plesiosaurs, and then she found this first British pterosaur and the first pterosaur away from Germany. And she's a very interesting character, and the last 10 years there's been 2 biographies about her. And it's kind of a sad story because she was shafted by her sex in the 19th century and sort of marginalized and died in poverty, which is kind of sad. But anyway, she did a huge service to vert paleo in the 19th century. Oh yeah, that's her dog. So here's an early restoration. So from 1828, you didn't get a published restoration until 1870, and it's actually pretty good. There'd been a steady flow of pterosaurs from Germany as well, so people had a nice idea. And if you compare this illustration from, 140 years ago, and we can come to a more modern one, which I really like this painting. This is by John Sibbick. And this is from a book from 1991 called The Illustrated Encyclopedia of Pterosaurs by Peter Wellenhofer. And it's been referred to as the Pterosaur Bible. It's such a good book, and it's so comprehensive. Its only problem is that it's 30 years old. The basic information is fine in this book. Some things have changed, but there's been so much happen in the last 20 years. And there's only been 2 other pterosaur books in the last 20 years, and one just came out a few years ago. But I really like these paintings. They're so good, and the nice change from the old reptilian model, they're sort of more this intermediate bird-reptile model that we get now. And you'll notice the skull on this thing is quite colorful, because a lot of people are wondering, was this thing living something like a puffin? Most of the pterosaurs come from marine coastal settings, and some of them have been found with fish bones in their gut. If you look at isotopic studies of their bones, they've been eating marine-derived food. And so the idea is that Dimorphodon was also some sort of fish eater. So I want to put pterosaurs in their time context. So current best estimate for the age of the Earth is 4.6 billion years. We're only interested in about the last 540 million. We'll zoom in on that. I'm sure you'll recognize lots of these names. And for our purposes, again, we're only interested in the Mesozoic, the middle life, from about 250 million to 66 million. Pterosaurs occupied almost all of that, from about the middle of the Triassic right up to the very end at 66 million. And they were part of a huge event that happened during the Triassic. You had this mass extinction at the end of the Permian at 250, where it's estimated something like 95% of species went extinct. So you can imagine the decks were cleared on land and sea. And it took a few million years for evolution to get back up and start producing new varieties of organisms. And there's this huge variety of reptiles came out. And that's what this is highlighting. But there was another major extinction at the end of the Triassic, which clobbered all sorts of weird and wonderful things from the Triassic. You just don't hear about them, I think, because a lot of the fossils are from South Africa or Eastern Europe or the Urals and stuff. But there's amazing stuff. But pterosaurs appear as part of this major radiation in the Triassic. And birds appear a bit later in the Jurassic. But dinosaurs also appear at the same time as pterosaurs in this major Triassic radiation. I'm so glad pterosaurs made it through. They weren't very abundant in the Triassic, and just one kind made it across the boundary. It would be so sad if we didn't have this diversity that I'm going to show you later. So the Triassic, as I'm saying, it's a key time, but it was such a narrow window. 50 million years out of 4.6 billion is just 1.1%, and yet so much happened. Here's this slice again showing the huge variety. And this is a stripped down thing, because there's other plants and animals as well at this time. So I just want to highlight who appears in the Triassic that we're familiar with today. First turtles, first frogs, first crocodiles running around on two legs, first mammals, first dinosaurs, and for us today, we're interested in the first pterosaurs. So if you go back in time and to the late Triassic, the continents are still stuck together, but they're starting to break up. So you may have heard of Pangaea, where during the Permian, all the continents came together and formed this single landmass. But in the late Triassic, Jurassic boundary, it's starting to pull apart. You're starting to see the continents fragmenting back again. And just to orient you again, here's North America and Greenland. There's Western Europe over there. That's South America and Africa. And then what will become separate regions of India, Australia, and Antarctica were also joined together. So this was the geographic setting. And I often think it must never have rained in the late Triassic because there's no clouds. So where do these earliest pterosaurs come from? They come from fine-grained marine sediments. Because their skeletons are so delicate, they need exceptional conditions to preserve them. So we've got one site in East Greenland, and then there's a couple of sites in Switzerland and northern Italy, and that's it. And you can see they're near these ancient shallow seas. They're not on outer coast, which is sad for us because my great hope is, why can't we find a pterosaur from the Triassic marine rocks we get here in Western Canada? It would be so nice to find them, but I think the sediments that we get our marine fishes from, they're further offshore. And I don't think little delicate pterosaur carcasses were making it that far offshore. So I may turn very blue holding my breath, waiting for a pterosaur. This is the earliest known pterosaur. It's amazingly complete and it's amazingly sophisticated. This isn't some proto-pterosaur sort of flying animal. This is a fully evolved, very elaborate flyer with all sorts of specializations. And that's a bit of a nuisance because it makes it hard to figure out who its nearest relatives are. I just want to zoom in on the head and just show how specialized it is. So at the top is the drawing of the crushed, flattened skull. Yeah, most pterosaurs are two-dimensional fossils, with a few rare exceptions. And if you look at the teeth, it's got all sorts of different types of teeth along the jaw. And when you look at even closer, the smaller teeth, they've even got three cusps on them. They're extremely sophisticated. This is in total contrast to the earliest dinosaurs, which have what's known as homodont dentition. The teeth are all basically the same. But if you look at the earliest pterosaur, it's got what's known as heterodont dentition. Different teeth doing different things along the jaw. So this is a cladogram showing the relationships of archosaurs. We know pterosaurs sit somewhere within Archosauria. So they're not mammals, they're not amphibians, there's not even crocodilians or crocodilian relatives. But the hard part is, it's because they're so specialized, it's really difficult to determine exactly who they're related to. And so not only are they super specialized, but the fossils are very flat, very thin, and crushed. The current favored idea, is that they're closely related to dinosaurs. That mainly is a lot based on the ankle structure. This group name at the bottom, Ornithodyra, means bird ankle. So dinosaurs and birds probably share a common ancestor sometime in the middle Triassic, maybe as far back as the early Triassic. Other groups are being proposed, such as a group called the Prolacertiforms. That's the other second one, but just a handful of people promote that. Most people like a close relationship with dinosaurs, but they're certainly not dinosaurs. They're very distinctive. There's two main types of pterosaur. One's called the Rhamphorhynchoids, and the other's the pterodactyloids. And this figure highlights some of the key details. They've got basically the same body plan. You just change the proportions of the various bones. I think the biggest difference is in the tail that the Rhamphorhynchoids have, quite substantial, but the pterodactyloids didn't need it. And there's a little diagram of a restored Rhamphorhynchid with its tail and the pterodactyloid. So people have thought that these guys, because they were the first flyers, maybe they weren't so good at flying and they needed this tail with a rudder of some sort. So the illustrations be done with this tail vein horizontal. That would have controlled the pitch of the body. Other people think it's better restored as being vertical because that tail vein is actually, most of them that are preserved are asymmetric, which wouldn't be good if you're trying to keep a balance in this frontal, but it would work if you're trying to keep as a rudder. I think of these as like training wheels for pterosaurs. A few million years later, the pterodactyloids have mastered flying better, and they can dispose of the training wheels. So there's this huge diversity that most people don't know. Here, look at this, a range of skulls. They're so bizarre, and when you really look at them, they just get even more bizarre. So this diagram I stole from Dave Unwin's book from 2006, and he shows in dark blue the known fossil occurrences, and in the pale blue, although it looks a bit green on here, is the inferred. So yes, the pterosaur fossil record is patchy, but when you do cladistic methods like this, it lets you connect up the dots. And you can start to make predictions about where you will find pterosaurs in time and space. And there's a really nice example from Alberta, where Michael Ryan, from his cladogram studies of ceratopsians, he predicted he would find a certain type of ceratopsian. He said, we'll find it here in rocks of this age, and he did. So that's really nice that this has become like a predictive science. And at the bottom, there's these little icons of little feet. This is these are the pterodactyloids, and these are pterosaur footprint record. It starts in the late Jurassic, just at the same time as the pterodactyloids appear. We have no footprints for the Rhamphorhynchoids from the Triassic or from the Jurassic. And it's thought that this reflects where these animals were living. The interpretation is that the Rhamphorhynchoids were living in forested environments or rocky cliffs, which would not be good for preserving footprints. But the pterodactyloids started to live in these shoreline habitats along oceans, lakes, rivers, and they were also bigger, so they had a better way of making footprints, or having their footprints recorded. So I just want to highlight some pterosaur lifestyles. The most common interpretation for something like Rhamphorhynchus is that they were fish eaters. Their bodies are found so commonly in marine settings. There's this late Jurassic site in Germany, Solnhofen, and there's also another one, Holzmaden. there's just loads of pterosaurs preserved in these fine-grained sediments offshore. And a modern analog would be something like the tern catching fish. There's the well-known pteranodon. There's about 1,000 specimens of pteranodon have come from Kansas. That's chalk in inland sea deposits. And these things were found hundreds of kilometers from the nearest shoreline. And the analog is they thought they lived like albatross, being out on over water for days and days fishing. And not enough of them perished far out at sea to become preserved. So I want to say something more about Rhamphorhynchus and its diet, because we've got a nice example just a few hundred meters away. This is a specimen in our collections, and you can see, it's really nice. You can see traces of the wing membrane around it. There's also this tail vein on ours. We can zoom in on that. I hope you can make out the change in texture to see that tail vein on the end of it. So it's probably been folded over when it got flattened on the seabed. So this is from this late Jurassic Solnhofen site, about 155 million years. There's been hundreds of these things found. But I want to zoom in on this part at the rear end of the body. And we're looking between the legs at the end of the tail, and look at this structure here. This looks like it's been ejected from the body, and it's thought to be a coprolite, fossilized feces, and it's just packed solid with these little tiny hook-like things. First, we thought it was hooks from squid and octopus. Their suckers have little keratinous or rigid elements to help grip. But we showed pictures to people and checked in books ourselves, and they all said, nope, can't be from squid or octopus or ammonites or those other sorts of cephalopods. They're not spines. No one could recognize them that. They don't look like teeth. They don't look like scales. But there's two clumps, and it's the shape, the size, the position. It looks like it's being excreted from the body. So we have this evidence of their diet directly. Our specimen also has seriously digested bits of bone. We had a bunch of people look, and everybody couldn't pick out anything in detail. The thinking is that pterosaurs, because they were active flyers, had really fast metabolisms and very rapid digestion. So things didn't keep their shape in the stomach very long because they were just quickly broken down. So back to lifestyles. The Ashdarchids were some of the last pterosaurs, but they were also extremely large, and many features of their anatomy suggest that they were spending a lot of time on the ground as terrestrial predators. And I found this really nice picture. That's an unlucky duck. So birds continue the tradition of terrestrial predation. And this is Quetzalcoatlus, the largest known pterosaur, although it's far from complete. So the suggestion was, what if these things were scavengers, like vultures today? So these things are really big, just like vultures are very big birds to muscle their way in on a carcass. I also think one of the reasons Quetzalcoatlus might be big was to intimidate any of the theropod dinosaurs, which were also there. Also, Quetzalcoatlus, unlike most pterosaurs, was found at a site about 400 kilometers from the nearest shoreline, well inland, in a very arid habitat. Its remains have been found. So this doesn't seem to have been your typical seagoing fishing pterosaur. Another example, there's Pterodostro. This thing's known from eggs and babies and all the way up through adults. And it's got this very bizarre teeth on its lower jaw. They're a few centimeters long. There's hundreds and hundreds of them in the lower jaw, and little stubby teeth on the top. And the interpretation is that these things were like flamingos. They would have been filter feeding crustaceans from possibly saline lakes. Flamingos are pink because of the crustaceans that they eat. So the idea is that Pterodostro might have also been pink, because if it was eating these little crustaceans. Another example is a thing called a Neurognathus. The name means frog jaw. It's quite small. It's got a very large head, broad mouth, very big eyes, and it's got bristles around the rim of its mouth. And the analogy with this one, what if it's a nocturnal thing eating insects on the wing? Just like a nightjar, they've got modified feathers which act as bristles around their mouths. So I think already you can appreciate that there's more to pterosaurs than good old pteranodon. Oops. So I want to say something about flying because that's what really characterizes them. So the two other winged vertebrates are bats and birds. They've got the same basic structure, the bones in their arms, same as us, like a humerus, radius ulna, wrist bones, metacarpals, manual phalanges. But you change the proportions to make a wing. So in bats, you've got the fingers supporting most of the wing, and the wing membrane goes between the fingers and down to the legs and down to the tail. But in birds, you've still got these same bony elements, just shorten up the fingers and digits and compress them and merge them. But the flight surface is formed by a different form of outgrowth of the skin. It's the feathers, and it's composed of separate elements. It's unlike the continuous surface with the bat. The bird one can separate. So they do the same thing. They're both wings. They function roughly similar, produce lift and thrust, but the construction is very different. And then there's the third version. So it's thought that the pterosaurs are supporting a flight surface on this super elongate fourth finger. And there's been a lot of controversy about how extensive is this flight membrane. I just drew in these arcs arbitrarily. But we do know that the flight membrane always comes down to the ankle in both groups. In the Rhamphorhynchoids, it actually goes between the legs, but not in the pterodactyloids. And then there's also a small membrane on the front of the arm between the elbow as well. But the proportions we have lots of preserved membranes for several different types of pterosaur, and you can see that the proportions and the wing shape, how much area there is, long, narrow, or short and broad. Different pterosaurs had different flying styles for different types of habitat, just like we see in birds today. So I want to focus in on an amazing specimen of the wing. We might think birds are quite sophisticated flyers, but after what I show you here, I think pterosaurs blow them away. Wait till you see this. So we've got this specimen called dark wing. I think it was just found about 10, 15 years ago. And the wing membrane itself is actually preserved, the actual carbonized film. And you can see the crinkles and wrinkles as the membrane was collapsing onto the seabed. This is one of these, a rare one that's almost 3D. It's not squashed flat. So what people did was they did some UV light imaging of parts of the wing. And these structures start to be revealed. You can see these tracts going around, and then there's all this radiating structure starting from like the top right and coming down to the lower left. And here's the interpretation of that. It's thought these are blood vessels right out within the wing. And the fine striations running across it are things called actinofibrils. All pterosaurs have been shown to have these super fine things, finer than human hair, and they seem to have controlled the stiffness of the wing and also how it would fold up. But they've also got this, I'll show you shortly, there's evidence for a muscle layer within the wing. And this blood circulation, not only would it nourish the muscle tissue, but it would also act as a cooling surface. I'll just show you the next one. This is from another site in Brazil with phosphatized soft tissue. So this animal, soon after it went to the seabed, bacteria are thought to have colonized the tissues and precipitated phosphate mineral right on the skin and muscle. And you get, I think there's a name like bacteriophotolithography to record it. And from that, we can see these layers. The wing is only about a millimeter or two thick. So you've got a stiffening layer with the actinofibrils. You've got a muscle layer which can actively control the tension within the wing and change its shape. And then you've got this blood supply which nourishes the tissues but could also act as a cooling system because the wings wouldn't have had the furry insulating covering on them. And if you've ever held a bird in your hand gets very hot and sweaty very quick because birds are so hot. So if you're an active flying pterosaur, how better to dump that excess body heat than just circulate the blood out to your wings and you just radiate away the heat. It's a really amazing system. And I think this trumps a bird wing any day because birds with their stiff, basically dead keratin feathers, they can't control the shape of their wing intrinsically, not unlike these guys. So if pterosaurs are in the air using their wings, but how do they get into the air? Most birds, if they're small enough, can jump or they can run. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of albatross taking off from these South Sea islands, and they're on a slope and they're running and they're running and they're running. You know, these things have got 3-meter wingspans. It's unlikely that a really big pterosaur could run and run and run. With the membranes coming down to their legs, they would not be able to get enough speed. So either they're jumping off the ground if they're small enough, maybe they're climbing up trees and jumping off, but there's another novel idea which has come out. So most pterosaurs, bigger than today's birds, too big to jump. What if they're using their arms? This is an idea that Mike Habib has been promoting. He came out of the Weissample lab, same place as Francois did, and he's been promoting this idea that pterosaurs were using their arms like the ultimate push-up. And he's done all these calculations and done muscle restorations, and he's worked out a sequence, you can see it at the bottom there, for how to launch with your arms. I think this is a really fun idea, but I'm still not totally convinced. Could you produce enough force quickly enough to get yourself high enough that you could still get your wings to flap? Because if you look in this next sequence, sure, you can push yourself off the ground a bit, but before you come back down, you need to be able to flap your wings at least once to get enough power to keep yourself going up. It would have to be very carefully choreographed. So until I see a physical working model, I'm still sitting on the fence, but it certainly is an interesting idea. So another amazing pterosaur thing is we now have eggs. There was almost nothing for 200 years, and then in a span of about 5 years, we got 3 eggs from around the world, mainly from China. So this is this Darwinopterus, which is a double benefit. There's the egg, but it turns out this animal is actually a perfect intermediate between the Rhamphorhynchoids and the pterodactyloids. You couldn't ask for a better intermediate fossil. But back to the egg. So one thing you can say is that this is with an egg being expelled from the body. This is the first time you can actually say this is the skeleton of a female pterosaur. You could never sex them otherwise. And we can look at this egg a bit more closely, and you can see it's crunched down or squished down. There's no broken eggshell. There's little fine wrinkles as a soft, leathery egg, a bit like a lizard egg, has been collapsed down. So it's unlike a bird egg or a turtle egg, which are quite hard and brittle. And also from these Chinese sites, there's actually embryos inside these eggs. And this is a huge surprise because look how well formed these bones are. Look at the ends of the bones are all nicely finished and ossified, got bone tissue in them. The interpretation is that pterosaurs weren't helpless little chicks in a nest. These things were ready to fly almost as soon as they hatched. And it's a very different reproductive strategy from birds. Old illustrations showed pterosaurs coming to feed young in a nest. We don't think that's the case now. These things are independent. Just like you think baby alligators and other crocodilians, they come out fully equipped with teeth and a hunting instinct. And these things were probably the same. So it's not good to use the bird analogy for pterosaurs in a lot of ways. So I want to highlight 2 famous fossil sites. This is the Solnhofen quarry down in Bavaria. There's several of them in the neighborhood. And so since Roman times, they've been mining these flat-lying limestone layers for floor tiles. And there's also a technique came along called lithography. You draw an image on these rocks. But the quarrymen working there keep coming across interesting fossils. So it's not just pterosaurs. There's little shrimps, lots of fishes, other types of crustaceans and crabs, turtles, there's lizards, there's the earliest bird Archaeopteryx, and there's even some dinosaurs. But the pterosaurs are the really amazing thing. There's lots of bits and pieces of pterosaur, like isolated arms and legs and heads, but it's the more complete body fossils which are the really amazing thing. And like I showed on our specimen, we've got the wing membranes preserved. You can see the wing membranes on this other Rhamphorhynchus here. And there's also Pterodactylus with wing membranes around the arms. So here's some illustrations of what these things would have looked like. this one in the lower right, this is this Anurognathus, this frog jaw. It's interpreted to be these aerial insect catchers, but all the others are thought to have been fish eating. There's another site, again, I've showed you a previous slide for the well-preserved tissues from Brazil. It's another one of these fossil Lagerstätte with amazing preservation of a variety of things. So there's insects, there's fish, there's more fish, and there's even a dinosaur. So not only from Santana do you get 3D fossils, you also get amazingly complete things and with soft tissue preservation. Look at the head crest on that thing on the lower right. And it's from the 3D things like Anhanguera that people have been able to work out how the joints work and come up with better ideas for pterosaur posture and how they could walk. And I've got restorations for these, but remember this one. Look at this, the teeth on this guy and this crest. And when you see it as the bare bones, you still want to think it's sort of reptilian. But look how it's been restored, almost like a seabird. I think this is great. It's so different. And it's all, unlike a bird, it's got claws on its hands and it's actually touching up to its face there. But look at these weird crests. There's several types of these tapijarids. The thing is on the right there with these absolutely unbelievable crests. And if it wasn't for that exceptional preservation, we would never have known about the extent of these crests. It makes something like Anhanguera look conservative. So this is what's come out in the last 20 years. So, time for my controversial but amusing and entertaining idea about these guys. So I mentioned that Quetzalcoatlus is found far inland, long away from any shoreline, and it's absolutely immense. And I've been thinking, what if, and it's hard to get something that big to make it fly. If you read about people trying to figure out the anatomy and flight potential of this thing, they're bending over backwards and tweaking their numbers unrealistically to try and make it fly. The pterosaur people really want it to fly. But I think, what if it's not a flying pterosaur? What if it's a secondarily flightless thing? And for good and bad, we have nothing like a complete skeleton for this thing. So when people are making these restorations, 95% of this is conjecture based on what we know from other pterosaurs. So I want to give you a few lines of argument that make me think this could be a flightless pterosaur. So about 5 years ago, I did this project looking body mass estimates for pterosaurs. And so I made all these digital models of the two main groups. I was really careful in making these models. I wanted them to be as accurate as possible. So I digitized all the best restorations I could find. I started assigning different densities to different body regions. So if you think density of water is 1,000 grams per liter, but pterosaurs have all these air sacs in their bodies, like in the trunk region here and in the neck. So I said, let's reduce the density because of air sacs down to 850. From studies of birds, their heads and necks are extremely light, down to like 300 grams per liter. I also included lung volumes in these things based on relationships with birds, because I know I said you shouldn't use birds too much, but birds and pterosaurs are both archosaurs, so they inherited a lot of their anatomy from a common ancestor. We know that there was even air sacs out in the arms, and inside the bone and outside of it, so the arms were less dense. The legs are probably quite solid muscle and bone, so they're still at 1,000. And I even worked out what's the weight of the flight membranes, assuming that they're 1 or 2 millimeters thick and estimating the areas. And so there's my Quetzalcoatlus model down there. The body's about 6 meters long. And so I calculated body masses and centers of mass and wing loading for all these things. I came up with these graphs. And so the top one shows body mass versus body length from the tip of the tail to the tip of the snout. And the other one is wingspan. These are common ways that bird masses are presented. And so everybody was happy with all these body mass estimates. All the pterosaur experts said, yep, these are really good, nice. And then I showed them my Quetzalcoatlus mass, way over here. And they said, nope, can't be, absolutely impossible. I said, why? It just can't. And they said, oh, you must have used a bad restoration. Well, I've used the ones that are out there. Well, show me one. Show me a new one. Well, I'll get it back to you later. So no one's come up with a an alternate body restoration, but they refuse to accept this big estimate. But I think they're lying to themselves that they buy into my other stuff. They really like it, but they choke on that one. So here's some other things to think about. Quetzalcoatlus is absolutely immense. It's at least as tall as a giraffe. A bull giraffe will weigh at least a metric ton. And here's Quetzalcoatlus, really stripped down, lots of air spaces in it. I get it at just over half a metric ton. But the pterosaur people are saying, no, it can't be more than 250, maybe 125. And some people have even said it's got to be 70. Come on. If it was going to weigh 70 kilos, about 90% of the body would be air. Just doesn't seem like a good thing. Here's another thing to think about. The largest flying bird we have today is a 16-kilogram Cory bustard. And it's been reported that when these things go to take off, they really have to work at it. These things are at the top edge for a flying bird today. The next size of bird up are flightless things like the ratites. We will ignore the island dwarfs like the kiwi and the kakapo from New Zealand. Let's stay with things that live on large continents. So we've got here's the rhea, the emu, cassowary. They start at 30 kilos and go up to just over 100. So there's this gap between flying and non-flying of about 20 kilos. There's nothing in between. And let's look at the pterosaurs. We've got pterosaurs, something like Tupexuara, going up to 23 kilos. And just for a laugh, really a laugh, let's go with this 70 kilo supposed weight for this giant pterosaur. If Quetzalcoatlus is flying and Tupexuara and smaller things are flying, where are all the other intermediate sized flying pterosaurs? I would predict we should expect to see them, but we don't. The fossil record is just completely absent for pterosaurs anything bigger than about Pteranodon. So here's Pteranodon. I estimate 18.6 kilos for it, and my critics said, yep, that's good, we like that. And they're all happy that it's like the albatross, but look how light the albatross is. It's less than half the weight of Pteranodon. So Pteranodon had a wingspan maybe up to 6 meters as well. But it's pterosaurs, everything about pterosaurs is the extreme for lightness. So the other thing to think about is pterosaurs were around for like 150 million years, at least. Birds have been around, and still around, for the same amount of time. So they've had equal amounts of time to evolve different body shapes and ways of living. Birds have evolved flightless forms many different times, independently. Different groups of birds have abandoned flight. And the thing to notice is all these flightless forms are much bigger than their flying relatives. The dodo is a type of pigeon. And there's really good evidence for a type of pigeon in the south, in the Indian Ocean area, that's a close relative of the dodo and was able to fly between islands. And so there's this huge variety of extinct birds that didn't, or fly, or living birds and extinct birds that don't fly. So if birds can do it, why not pterosaurs? So that's why I would like to think of Quetzalcoatlus as some sort of terrestrial predator scavenger. And boy, when I presented this to the audience at the meeting, half people thought it was really interesting and reasonable idea. The other half hated it. And the pterosaur people were really ticked off. Oh, the feeding frenzy was great. I touched a nerve. It was fun parrying all their questions. My talk was the last talk on the last day, and the room was packed. And afterwards, people were constantly coming and challenging me or agreeing with me. It was great fun. So I'll leave it at that. And oh yeah, don't think Mark Whitten thinks the same as me. He doesn't. Mark's one of the new pterosaur gurus, and he's all for Quetzalcoatlus still being a flyer. So I'm done, and I'll take some questions.